Hello and welcome to the BALLE podcast. Our guest today is James Johnson-Piett, Principal and CEO of Urbane Development and a 2013-2014 BALLE Local Economy Fellow. James, thanks for joining us.
It's always a pleasure, Andrew. How's it going, man?
It's going great. All right. Well, I want to get down to brass tacks here right off the bat. I was going through the Urbane Development website, and I've just got to ask. There are so many different things on there that you work on in terms of different kinds of clients, different types of services you offer, different types of approaches, different organizations. I just had to, out of the gate, I just had to know, what is the actual breakdown of how you spend your working time? Who are your clients? How are you spending your time? What are you doing? Technical assistance, economic development plans, financial consulting? Like, how's it break down for you?
Well, think of it like this. I think the single thread is we want to help communities that have been ignored from both the private and increasingly the public marketplace around goods and services, and whether that's public infrastructure or straight up, small business or big business development investment. Those are the places we're targeting. And so it's one of those things where it's such a kind of cornucopia of issues that you kind of trying to tackle, that you end up having to tackle everything at once. It's very multidisciplinary. And you begin to figure out, as you pull one thread, another thread, kind of tears, and you have to figure out how to kind of make all these things work. And you end up doing this really interesting multi-layered approach. But we do end up offering a ton of services because it's, in a way, it's a bit like triage. Like, you're trying to figure out how to save a multi-faceted organism. And so you think about cities, or any community, they are these really crazy organisms that you're trying to work with. And so, on a typical, there isn't, the short answer is that there are no typical days. I think from running a small business, that even though a lot of my work is working with small businesses, I think I always underestimate how much time you spend on admin. Just the amount of time you have to make sure that your own structure is proper and tight, so you can do the work you want to do. But typically, our work is three buckets, the way I like to describe it now. Part of it, probably the most high growth segment of our work is actually research, which I'll be really frank about. I'm not the biggest fan of doing it myself, but I do recognize the value, particularly from our perspective, where a lot of our work comes from a practitioner's perspective, being able to be an implementer and kind of walk it back and say, okay, here are the fundamental analytics and insights and research points that you should have in order to make a particular kind of decision, whether it's a policy decision or an investment decision in these spaces. It's important to know what's going on. So, it fits in within our mission, certainly. But this idea of really thinking about the pre-development phase, and so many people being excited about the possibility of different projects, we begin a lot more work in the ideation phase. So helping real estate developers, helping foundations, helping city governments, helping small businesses think through what they want to achieve at the baseline. And that's been a really interesting place to play, and something that we were used to, but it becoming a much more codified part of our work, where we're actually, pitching for a particular research project. And there's deliverables that look a lot more like a think tank, a lot less like a community development organization. So I think it's a really interesting kind of thing that's happening lately. So
does that hold true with, I know you work with a lot of smaller clients that are sometimes kind of functioning at the margins, like the small corner stores and things like that. Are those folks open to like paying for research, or does that seem like kind of,
well, we call
at that level, are they actually
right.
engaged in that as well?
You call it something different, I think. I think you don't have to couch it as research. We say, this is market intelligence. We're giving you business development insights, and it is, and it's true. I mean, it's not just jargon. The stuff that we do for small businesses, and usually, I'll be honest, in that space, you're probably talking about a third party intervening. So what you have happening is some intermediaries, probably a community development bank or a foundation or a public entity, who wants to service a series of small businesses. So they're the ones paying the bill, and then the small business owner is taking advantage of the opportunity. But we've been able to leverage that to have distinct relationships with small business owners who see the value in it. But you have to make that value proposition very clear. And I think, and when I advise, particularly with other groups who are trying to intervene in this space and we're not the direct provider, the first thing I say is, what's the value prop of what you're offering up? To your point, a good example, last night I was in Jersey City. I was meeting with a group of really motivated, kind of high energy folks who wanted to create a grocery co-op in Jersey City. And my questions were fundamental. We spent an hour together, and I didn't ask, questions about the pro forma or questions about their marketing plan. Right. I said, who are you trying to serve? You're a membership organization. What do your members look like? What do they want? Right. What is your value? And I think if companies, big and small, can't answer that question, you want, and regardless if you're nonprofit, you're going to run into problems. So, I think a lot of our work needs to be in that space where we're, there's a line on our site you probably saw where we're retail therapists. In a lot of ways, you can extend retail out into kind of community development, but we really are there to kind of listen and hopefully help pivot or help people reorient what they're up to get some more value and some more efficiency out of the work. So that's been interesting from the research side of it. And then, our project management and kind of technical assistance consulting is still kind of humming away. So like we said, there's still plenty of projects where, and actually Oakland's a good example, where we go out and actually have boots on the ground. We're in stores, we're in communities, we're helping think through those problems. It could be anything from, how do you finance this new development? How do we, get a team of architects and general contractors to look at this space when the deal's probably not that big for them? Or, like I'm in front of me right now, a set of blueprints that I have to draw. I literally have a pencil and a ruler. When we get off this this podcast, I'm going to draw on this piece of paper, scan it, and send it to my client and say, do this.
So, you're a Renaissance man, then, is what you're saying.
Yeah, a little bit. You kind of have to be in this space, but in my team, and I think the other thing too is, my team is a really interesting group of folks. At this point, we have folks who have lots of interesting competencies in urban planning, and the kind of culinary management space, and arts and culture, both policy and practice. The project that we did with the Hip Hop Museum was a really great example of us doing something else out of the box for our particular profile, but really being able to take the skills of some of our staffers and put them to use in another way. So that's been really fascinating. And then that last part.
When you talk about, I was just going to say, sorry, before you move on to that, when you talk about your team, is that staff or is that just partners that you collaborate with projects?
It's all the above. So, it's staff that is with us every day. It's, kind of project consultants who basically feel like staff, but they're focused on a particular project at a particular point in time. One thing that our website hopefully will reflect by the time this comes out is we have started something we're calling the Urbane Collaborative, which is really just, again, a codification of something that we've already been doing for years, which is really partnering with content experts and technical advisors who really amplify our work. So they, basically we provide the umbrella where we say, hey, look, this is the kind of work that we're doing, but, let's say somebody's really good at distribution and logistics. So we'll bring them in, they'll be part of our team for that particular project, and we'll run forward with it. So in that case, it gives us a chance to really push our work out beyond, what we're typically up to. And then in addition to that, we're percolating some ideas around, what would Urbane West look like, since we have a lot of interesting projects out in the Bay Area, but we're not based there. So what does that kind of look and smell like? So we're dipping our toe in that pool as well. But we have some really great partners out in the Bay Area who help us out a lot with the day-to-day work that we take on. And so we're on our end on the East Coast, we're focusing more on strategy and building up implementation planning. And then we look at to our partners to help us execute.
Great. And was there a final component of that work that you wanted to mention? So
that third part is I think what I'm most excited about. It actually, apropos to the timing, around last year at this time, I got slammed at my Social Venture Institute case study in Cortez Island. So my three.
Super excited.
It was funny. It was. It was a really good time, and I think of the three groups that went up, I definitely got the hardest. The hardest counselors, I'm going to butcher her last name, but I'm pretty sure it's Madeline Shaw. I could be making this up. But the CEO of Mother Jones magazine was one of my respondents, and she was the nicest of.
And for those who don't know, do you want to sort of set the scene about
what
that was and what you presented and go for it.
Right. So the idea around Social Venture Institute is we basically go to a lovely retreat in the middle of Cortes Island, BC. They lull you to sleep with all kinds of lovely natural wonders. You go get a massage. Yeah, absolutely. And then the previous month, you're as a case study presenter, you are charged with basically bearing your soul and talking about your company in really kind of granular detail. They're asking you for your operations information, for your financials, both current and historic. They want to know what your marketing strategic planning looks like, and you basically pose the group, and you have 3 respondents who are helping you kind of talk through a problem. So the whole point of it is, as a company, you're at a transitional point, and either it's focusing on operations, it's about capital, or it's about marketing, and you're charged with posing the group a question. And so my question was, how do I take my advisory firm that is consulting and either add or pivot into real property or real estate development? How do I get from the point where we're providing analytics for developers to where we are the developer who has the analytics? And so my job was to get up on stage and talk about this for 15 minutes and then shut up and let people tell me what was right or wrong about my company. And so it's a really intense process because you're laying yourself out. I mean, they're asking you, like, well, how much do you make? What would your margins look like? And why don't you make this much money? And, one of my respondents told me that if I was his if he was investing in me, he would fire me. That was the first thing out of his mouth, and some of it was for shock value purposes. But it's like, okay, right. Like that was a nice stiff jab, but it stuck with me because I think we're so used to, and particularly in the space of social enterprise or just in the social movement, kind of writ large, about everyone telling you how great your work is and how important
it's all good. It's all good. Absolutely. It's all positive. Yeah.
And you need people to be able to tell you, like, yeah, like your shit does stink a little bit, so we're gonna help you out with that. So I think that was good. But at the same time, what was equally interesting was the group in the audience. So then you have about 200 people in the audience who then respond to the respondents after you've presented. And again, you can't say anything. And so I felt like there was a kind of mini fight going on between the audience and the respondents, because the audience basically came to my rescue and was like, you guys don't understand what the hell you're talking about. He needs to do X, Y, and Z. And I got a lot of both great responses and actually really great mentors and partners and kind of thought partners around what I can do. So I've talked to a bunch of folks over the last year around how to help me with this pivot. And one suggestion I got from a commercial developer who was in the room was really salient. And his point was, and it was really simple. It was find a serial financier and find a serial contractor to work with. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially what we've been doing over the last year, is really building our partnerships up with real estate developers who have the scope and scale. But what we provide is really the both access to a new market that they're not used to working in, but they actually want to, and then also a really clear understanding on how to operationalize a broader vision for community development and not just simply building housing somewhere. And I think that particularly in big cities, but also just in urban spaces in general, throughout North America, there is a much bigger demand to try to create livable communities. I think, particularly in underserved markets where the more traditional trope is to basically build cheap housing, call it affordable, and set the stage for more market rate stuff that people who live there can't afford. Right. This is an alternative way of thinking about developing.
So I'm curious, you made a comment a little while back that you talked about the complexities of like the organism of the city. And it sounds to me like that, does that to you feel like your kind of work, like you're working on the city? Like you're working on the whole beast, right? Like you're not just working on your project, you're not just working on the neighborhood, you're not just working on the business. Like your interest is in reshaping the city. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think it's interesting and maybe partially true. I think, maybe at some meta level in my brain, I'm like, yeah, we're going to change the whole landscape.
Yeah,
How it's
yeah. Not that
been
you have
focused.
a God complex or something, but just that your bigger
Right,
picture vision is not just like how can we make the street work. It's how do we
right,
make the
right.
city work, right?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I totally want to see Andrew's golf because I want to totally start getting into like weird fractal sacred geometry right now because I feel like it's one of those things where it's like a snowflake, right? Like so, or any of these kind of natural organisms that have the same architecture at scale. So if we're fixing neighborhoods block to block or corridor to corridor, it's reflective in the bigger organism.
Right.
Because again, it's a system. So you're solving a problem that might be something that's chronic and that's affecting other parts of the system. So if you just like if one part goes down, it's making the others work harder. If one part gets fixed, it hopefully makes the other parts work a little bit more effectively.
And sending different patterns and ideas, rippling throughout the whole system as well.
Right, because we're in love. There's two kind of there's two verbs and adjectives that I think are overutilized. One is curate, and the other one is disruptive. And so I think in both cases, we are trying. I think we're trying to do both of those things, but in a way that isn't so douchey and is much more reflective of the people who exist in the space currently versus who we think can pay to exist in our newfangled idea moving forward. Right. I think that's the real kind of competitive advantage that we offer. So,
right. So, is it with that interest, with that sort of holistic vision, then do you you've shifted? I mean, are you still as focused on food businesses and food related work, or do you feel like you're really pushing and shifting hard in a sort of more of a real estate, property, commercial development type of focus?
Yeah, I think it's, if I had to be honest, it's probably the latter. Not that we're not doing food business work. Certainly, one of the kind of projects that we're looking to advance as our own, not just as a consultancy, is a kitchen incubator concept that we're working on. So certainly, food business are a piece of it. But again, one of our coolest clients is a hip hop museum concept that we've been pushing around for the last year, and they've done some really interesting projects on the ground over the last 6 months. They actually had a pop-up exhibition in a Broadway show that just recently closed. So so I think for us, when you think about certain industries and certain fields of interest that have this kind of connective tissue built into it, like food was one of those things that, again, you're going to every person on the supply chain and on the value chain is going to feel that, not just from I want to be able to get food from point A to point B, but food has this environmental relationship, this social relationship, this economic relationship, and it's all kind of tied in together. And I think other types of industries play a similar role. I mean, arts and culture is another one. So I think we're thinking about delving into that space because it helps build communities across scale. Interestingly enough, technology, we've been kind of thrust into this sustainable technology space, particularly with the view of disaster relief and recovery. Really? A lot of the work that we've been up to in Manhattan, where we were actually based, has been targeted around how do we create resilient communities through the need to help recover from disaster and crisis.
Right.
And
was
so
that
we've been
specifically
working on
tied with Superstorm Sandy type work?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our bigger clients and funner projects over the last year has been this kind of 5-year comprehensive food resiliency plan that we got asked to put together down in the Lower East Side of Manhattan for a neighborhood called Two Bridges, and the program was called Neighbor Food. And so initially when we got pulled in, it was, well, the supermarket that was there for 30 years basically was already going to leave anyway, but Sandy exacerbated it. The parking lot got flooded. They lost a lot of their equipment. So that closes down. You lose 50,000 plus square feet of food retail, and you have 51,000 people within 10 block radius who all of a sudden are like, well, where do I shop now? And the realization was there's 200 plus food businesses within 5 blocks of any of these people. And obviously a lot of them are right next door, but they've somewhat ignored because they had this one-stop shopping that occurred there. So the impetus of the program was very much food plus this resiliency piece. But then it began to morph in a really interesting way around, well, how can we utilize this network of not just small businesses, but of infrastructure node points. So now we're talking about 200 physical places where we can do some interesting things and daisy chain them together and do something that's really evocative. And so what's come out of that is some really, really interesting partnerships and project opportunities. So we're really testing out the idea of what would a microgrid technology do for both public housing, where there's several kind of really dense public housing campuses right in that neighborhood, and then tying that energy creation to the surrounding neighborhood itself. So you have all these commercial corridors that abut it. So during a crisis and your power goes out, well, what do people need? They need heat. They obviously need power, but they need heat. They need potable water, and then they need food. And so connecting those dots together, where the store owners and the public housing tenants are working together around resiliency, both around communications. There's a wireless mesh system that's built into a plan that we're talking about for that neighborhood. There is a communications portal, which basically would work off the grid. Our project is called Beyond the Grid. So the idea would be to basically create off the grid power, off the grid communications, and off the grid kind of neighborhood nodes where folks will be able to get basic goods in crisis. But then in fair weather, they'd be able to utilize the same system as an alternative for their wireless data plan, for instance, or if you're a store creating a community-based advertising portal where you'd be able to advertise some of your goods and services through the same network that you'd use during crisis. So we're playing around with a lot of really interesting stuff that's using, again, food as one layer, but it's given us entree into a whole other set of community development opportunities. So that's a good example of that kind of work as we move forward.
How many different clients are you working with at any given time? How many different projects do you have your hands in? How many different clients you're working with?
Yeah, it's funny. We're doing our website updates. So I just had to count all this stuff. So
you lost track.
Well, it felt like that a little bit. I was like, it was more about how do you categorize them, like you're talking about. Like we had to create new language because the business model shifted a bit. So how do we create the new language around what service points we're offering people? And so right now, we have I think we have 6 active projects and then 2 that were just finished in the last 6 weeks. So we have 6 projects happening right now. 2 of them, hopefully, we wrapping up by September, which, knock on wood, which will help a little bit with all the manic. You don't want to have manic summers. So that hopefully helps with that. But it's actually pretty evenly split. So two of the projects are kind of real estate development focused. One's in Detroit, one's here in New York. 2 are research focused, and again, one's in Detroit and one's in New York. And then the third is 2 project management projects. One's in Oakland, and then one's here in New York as well. So, I think that the issue becomes how do you manage the current work with the speculative work you want to do moving forward. And so that's been both a challenge and a really interesting learning for us. Is how do we structure our business development planning? How do we structure our marketing so that we're not overwhelmed with spec work, trying to rev the engine up while we're trying to really do high quality work on the ground.
And where are those deals coming from?
The new deals the new deals
general, where are you finding where are things actually materializing? What are the channels that you're actually getting deals through?
It's a really good question, and one that I struggle with, because right now we still don't do a ton of directed marketing, and it's sad because I'm like, we should, but it's still a lot of word of mouth. One of my old tropes when I would do presentations would talk about how I'm the fixer. I'm Winston the Wolf, and I come into your community in the shadows and fix stuff, and then no one knows I came in and everything was great. And there's still a little bit of that. And I think there's this kind of ripple effect that happens when you do a good project somewhere and it works. Then people say, oh, you need to talk to James. You need to talk to Urban about this project. Yeah. And that's been accelerating lately, where something new comes across my desk almost every day. And it's now okay, this is a really cool project. I don't know if we can do it or if I have the capacity for it, which makes the Urban Collaborative such a really interesting opportunity, because we wouldn't have to turn down things as often because we have partners who we trust and we have a system in place to be able to get things done, even if we're not necessarily the ones that will point on it.
Right.
So it's really trying to be able to amplify that. But I'd say word of mouth is still number one. We do look at some RFPs that come across our desk, particularly ones from real estate developers. Usually, developers we've worked with in the past will reach out and say, "Hey, we have a bid coming up. Would you guys want to play a role in it?" And then we discuss what that role looks like. It could be as simple as just again developing a retail plan for them, and saying, "Okay, you need to provide projections for this property, so you can get your financing in place."
Right.
But for the most part, it's a kind of mixture of a little bit of directed business development, so kind of trolling for proposals and RFPs and opportunities. A lot of networking that I don't think of it as such, but lots of meetings and conversation with people and talking to them about what their issues are, and then it may evolve into work. I mean, last night's a really good example, like I was talking about. Like I went to this meeting as a favor to a friend, talking about the Jersey City Co-op, and what came out of it was potentially an opportunity to work with them.
Right.
But my instinct was actually no. I kind of steered it away from that part of it. It really was more in my mind about them making some really core strategic decisions, and I felt like before they got to a point of trying to hire a consultant, they needed to answer some questions for themselves, or at least maybe they hire a strategic planning consultant, but that's not really what we're up to. So so I think there's all kinds of ways that you end up getting the work done. But I know in the fall it's going to be much more traditional. So the conference circuit, I'm speaking at all 3 conferences. So that's always a big boom. And then we have our existing projects when they finish, and then we hopefully promote them. Ends up being a good way to create new work. Right. So this report's going to get released. Us along with a partner of ours, eConsult Solutions in Philadelphia, worked on a report for the Detroit Food and Fitness Collaborative, which is a Kellogg-funded food and fitness collaborative, and it is. We were asked to measure the size and composition of the economic food system in Detroit, and then I think what happened with that project was it became a much more robust, much more interesting, community-focused project. Well, how do you define a food system through multiple lenses, and how do you execute a vision for a new system amongst those lenses, one of them being economic? And so that report is a robust 150 pages and will be coming out hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So that's going to hopefully be a good opportunity to use it as a promotional tool.
You mentioned Detroit.
My heart's always in Philly, but Detroit is right there. The Detroit, actually, I mean, there wouldn't be an Urbane if there wasn't the folks at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. It's their economic development agency. They're my first clients. They really believe in what I was thinking about, 6 years ago. And, they've been super awesome, both in terms of as a client, but also as a partner. And our relationship has evolved over time as well. So they gave me the entree to the city. And I think over the last half decade, it's been really, really great.
Well, I got a Detroit question for you.
All right.
The 2 main threads of national writing and attention on Detroit have been the classic sort of obsessing over the ruination and the decay and the downfall of Detroit, and then the sort of flip side of that has been the Detroit as reborn entrepreneur utopia, where there's just a paradise of doing new things and exciting stuff happening. And of course, I'm sure there's obviously both narratives have some truth to them, but I'm kind of interested just in your gut level response. The news still keeps coming out about, the water shutoffs or the city, the city finances or the city police being monitored by the feds and not. And the news is still coming out, but I feel like the wave of national obsession has subsided a little bit. And I'm sort of curious, what's your take on where things are at right now?
My gut visceral reaction is find a way to invest in Detroit because you will get your money back. And yes, a piece of it is just the believing in cities. There's too many just natural occurring benefits of being, in that place. There's so much built up infrastructure that may be laying fallow right now, but has a opportunity to really be, reutilized and repurposed quickly and efficiently. I think obviously, like most major cities, it's next to a water body. It is still the biggest international trade portal between the bridge that connects Windsor to Detroit. It still has more international commerce occurring than any other place in the country. There's just too many things happening in that general region to ignore that opportunity just from that gut level. But I think maybe the more interesting thing that's happening is there's like I said, there's these two narratives, and I'm going to use two shorthands for you. I mean, there's the poverty porn narrative, which is, again, you talk about the ruination of the city. There's like, let me navel gaze at the ruins of this place. But that certainly attracts lots of eyeballs, and those eyeballs are spending their money and their time and their effort to figure out what that looks like. And then equally, and maybe even more so, you have this kind of manifest destiny frontier thing going on.
Right.
And I'm using these terms on purpose because both of them have certain paternalistic elements that are in play. I mean, let's not ignore the fact that the city's at this point 83% African American. It was more than that. So I think if you look at even the statistics around the amount of displacement that's occurred even in the last 5 years, even as the population is doing some interesting things. If you go to the neighborhood level, who's coming in, who's coming out, I think it's interesting. There's some interesting things going on there. But I think if you're just talking about at a really gut baseline level, I think Detroit has too much going on, both in terms of new blood and I think more importantly, existing players who again are resilient and have figured out a way to make it work despite just the public level of discord that's occurred. I mean, if anything, what I'm more fascinated about is what happens when a city, and I think from a commentary standpoint, this is beginning to happen. The city's municipal functions and their public functions are getting stabilized, if nothing else. You can agree or disagree with the tactics, but there are certain things that are happening that didn't happen before, good or bad. And so, as that kind of moves forward, how do you operate in a space that has a little bit more structure? Because I think over the last 10 years, people have been able to really operate without, that public overlord, for lack of a better term, dictating certain things. You could do
limited regulations, limited enforcement, and sort of,
there's tons of regs. Just the enforcement part is the one that was bullshit.
Sorry, there,
so I think that piece of it is going to matter, in terms of how people behave in that new environment, and also how, and to another point of it, how do you subvert it? I mean, maybe it's not the thing you want, and I think Detroit, maybe more so than other places, there is a really strong dialogue around equity, and around who gets to decide what happens to this place. And obviously, like in most places, money rules all. But I think if anywhere where they can be a more open dialogue around, who's going to lead the charge and what's going to happen, I think Detroit can be that place.
You spoke to all the assets and invaluable resources and opportunities and so forth that derive from being in a city or from a city existing, or that a city sort of inherently possesses. And your work is obviously very urban focused in terms of being in urban areas and working with cities. Have you had the opportunity to work in rural places, rural communities? And if not, does it interest you? How do you see your work sort of translating into different, how would that look different, or what would be different about an experience of doing the kind of work that you're doing in, small towns, rural areas, things like that?
It was interesting. One of the coolest projects that I ever did was in Dixon, New Mexico, which was like maybe 1,500 people. It's a grocery cooperative. Actually, I was tied into it because I was a reviewer for a federal grant program that they were awarded. And then the next layer was, okay, now you got all this money. How are you going to spend it? How do you execute? So we did one of our bodega boot camps, but it wasn't at a bodega. It was at a kind of general store in the middle of New Mexico. And what was really fascinating was, there were some different issues. Like, with a lot of urban enterprise, you're trying to leverage density, both in terms of how many customers can I get in per hour, or how can I leverage certain volume opportunities to get economies of scale. In this case, it was, how far reaching can we go given our limited size to get certain people to come in? How can we differentiate our products and then figure out a way to get it distributed to us? So they were slightly different variations on the theme, but it was still, I'm a small business and I'm trying to figure out how to maneuver it. I think the more interesting work that we do tend to get pulled into slightly with smaller towns is you have a kind of you have a mono industry, or you have a single corridor that's trying to reactivate, and it becomes very quickly not just about the business development entrepreneurship elements, but it's about how do you create, again, this overarching business attraction strategy, or how do you create this overarching attraction strategy in general, maybe quality of life for these places. And so, but you're leveraging different things. It's not like, oh, we're going to have so many people, so many jobs, and so many, so much economic investment. It's
right.
How do you sell this small town? Like, what's going to be the thing that's going to either, make someone come here. So the job part is part of it, but I think maybe even more importantly, how do you keep your people?
Yeah.
And I know for us, we get pulled in more around the thought leadership side of this. So it's how do we try to translate these solutions that we come up with in the urban space for the rural space. And one thing I mentioned, the last conversation I had about rural economic development, I was actually talking about data farms. And I was like, man, you have these towns, they have all this space, like I can't imagine how many servers that Facebook needs. I mean, I already know they basically buy out farms anyway. But
right.
It's like, how can you, it's like, how can you build out, how can you build out a structure so that like there are industries that naturally have high growth potential that
right.
could have, again, be focused in the industry. So some of the similarities I see certainly is in the workforce space. Regardless of urban or rural, you have particularly people who are post-industrial. So they were trained in a space that wasn't in the industrial age,
right.
And they know how to work a machine and know how to like move things through a supply chain. And that's
right.
not how we work anymore. And how do you retrain that worker to be able to either figure out how to use that knowledge base to create their own industry or your own business, or how do you just retrain them to do new work?
Right.
And I think the other big thing that's a similarity is the aging effect. So you have people who are retiring at 80 instead of 65. People who need to do career changes. So it's interesting in that space. We haven't done a ton of that work outside of more of the kind of very high level ideation work, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in the rural economic development construct. And you're from Montana, so particularly in these states that have a lot of natural energy, and some of the struggles that come along with, like, again, you have this asset. In this case, it's a fossil fuel.
Right.
But how do you build a community? How do you build equity within that structure, when basically all everybody wants to do is extrapolate out? So
yeah, other than this natural resource base and the density question, are there other big differences, really sort of fundamental differences that you see between the urban and rural situations vis-a-vis your work?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is harder to find partners, content partners who can fill in roles. So, if we're talking about logistics and distribution, like what it looks like to try to build out a network in the middle of a rural area versus where you do it in the middle of an urban area, completely different kind of constructs. You can bring some of it over, but and that's some of that could simply be our relationships. I mean, there's more people we can go out there and meet. But I think the other thing is it's hard. It's harder to get investors excited about rural spaces. Not to say that there isn't a ton of folks who are focused in the food and ag space. Everybody and their mom wants to invest in that space right now. But like you would think, let's say, I don't know, Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Cheyenne, or someplace where there may be a whole big infrastructure around ranching or or farming. That would be where you want to invest your opportunities around research and development. But those things are still happening on the coast. And so, and some of that's because that's where the universities are concentrated in, so on and so forth. But I think you have some of those issues that are occurring. So the talent pools aren't necessarily there in the same level of abundance you find in cities. And I think some of it's just shape marketing. I mean, people, when you think about rural areas, I mean, you automatically kind of go to farmer as a construct. And so if you're into that, great. But there's so many more narratives that a city can provide in terms of why you want to go either do service work or do investment work or whatever else, because there's just so many options you have. And so trying to pitch a rural area for a concept becomes, in my mind, a little bit more difficult. I'd say it's impossible, but it's there's a different way you're going about it. And so I think those things make that issue somewhat complicated, but not impossible. And I think some of the more innovative folks that actually have met through BALLE are coming from rural areas, or at least small to mid-sized towns that are basically approximating the cities that would represent those rural areas. Right. Because again, they have to think creatively. So a lot of it's a platform for them to have an opportunity to be able to talk through what they have.
Right. Well, I got a bigger picture question for you here. I'm sort of curious, when you look at your work and you think about your work right now, to what degree do you feel like you're kind of playing the game by the rules of the current system? And to what degree do you feel like you're changing the game? So where are you at now versus where would you like to be?
That's a great question. Yeah, something that I probably don't explicitly articulate publicly a ton, but I think at some point you have to decide you're going to be the reformer or you're going to be the revolutionary. Right. And there's times actually funny. Even I'm going to tell a little bit of Valley fellow dirt. I think there's definitely a continuum of people in terms of like where they fall in line. And I think I always look at the revolutionaries with a little bit of envy, and I always feel like I'm not doing enough truly revolutionary work and trying to really like blow the system up a bit, even though I have many days where I think the system should be blown up. But I think our firm, and I think myself, and when I think about the work we do, I think we're straddling the line. I think we're looking at the current system and saying, okay, this exists. There's a big institutional reason why it's hard to break this thing down. And I think there's lots of really great people who would like to reform some of the ways we do what we do. And I think there is room for innovation. And I think thinking about it, if anything, if there's one disruptive thing that I'm trying to put in place is one, essentially poor, low income areas with concentration of people of color are markets. They are places that people spend money every day and a significant amount, that are worthy of investing in, that are worthy of, looking at from a talent pool standpoint and really cultivating a strategy around how do you, generate wealth through the investment points that exist there. And then the second piece, is which one I really care about, is how do you make sure that wealth gets dispersed to the people who are providing that information for you. And that second part is probably a little bit more revolutionary. But the first part I think is not that off. I mean, I talked about this at the conference. Yeah. There aren't too many high growth markets left in this country. You can't squeeze. There's only so many demographic segments left, and one of the biggest growth points are these markets. And yet, you look at companies; they're not structured for engaging them. They don't know how to market to them. They don't know how to build products for them. And I think that's
at even a deeper level. You made the point at the conference as well when you spoke about just the missed opportunities in terms of investment. The car service companies that are flying under the radar, unregulated, those sort of entrepreneurs who are functioning sort of off the books, and just the people who are seeking finance in, I believe you call it the gray economy, the sort of like semi-legitimate finance. It's kind of just a missed opportunity for
absolutely. If I was really revolutionary, I'd actually pivot into just being a broker. I would find the investable opportunities and put them in front of people with money. And say, here you go. Give me 2% of that. But I think it's this kind of, but I think it's exactly right. It's this kind of nexus point where the missed opportunity in the market and the missed opportunities in the kind of community and public space is where I'm most fascinated in playing in. I mean, I don't know if that's revolutionary or not, but I think this idea of not focusing on service so much, not saying, oh, we have obesity issues, oh, we have poverty issues, oh, we have violence and crime issues. Let's figure out how we're going to either make this work on a public sector intervention, or make this work within some sort of nonprofit context. But how do we engage business to help with these problems? Because it behooves business to do it, because it makes their environment more effective to sell their product. And I think many businesses, and I think that's the point we make in our work, is that these businesses have shown themselves to be resilient, even within the context of lack of investment, even within the context of lack of public infrastructure.
They've been majorly stress tested. Like if you want to determine your risk factor on them, it's like they've been through a lot, right? They've kind of proven
absolutely. And then you look at the social side of it. They also end up providing way more services outside of their typical core value point because of the lack of other infrastructure.
Right.
So they've had to be therapists, and they've had to be the Chamber of Commerce, and they've had to be all these other things outside of their core function. And I think is a really powerful place to start when you want to solve these social problems. So I think that idea is relatively novel, but I always feel like nothing's new under the sun. And I think if you ask individuals on the ground, so if you're going into Detroit or Philly or New Orleans, you say, where are the places I go to commiserate, or where are the places I go with trusted and valuable advising, I think you'd start to see some of the same places pop up. Like, it's the corner store, and it's the barbershop, and it's the nail salon, and it's the church, and it's the school and everything else. And so those are the institutions and businesses that you want to be able to focus on, because they've been able to weather the storm. But then I think the flip point is, then how do you get them really tactical, high-end, high-value, good services, information, data, investment, like, essentially, like, in my mind, how do you give them the same treatment as you give a really, really great idea from an entrepreneur who gets VC funding?
I want to turn that around and ask you, what's the downside? It's easy to point to all the disadvantages they suffer from being sort of missed by the market for obvious reasons, and all the compensations they have to make. But what would they lose through that legitimization process, or through that process of being pulled into those more conventional channels?
Oh, if you're talking about,
or is it just all upside?
No, I just think there's some risk factors you have to think about. But if you're operating in the gray right now, I mean, the biggest thing is, overhead's overhead. So, if you also have to add taxes, a reasonable payroll and benefits to your setup. I mean, that's one. I mean, it's interesting. I'm sure Jess talked about this too with her operation. I always miss the name. I think Operation Overground. Her project in Detroit gets to this exact issue. Like, it's not only creating a space that's palatable for underground businesses, but then it's making sure that they're not making money because they're cutting expenses, but they're actually making money because their revenues are legitimate and fair. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with someone who's small. It's like, why am I going to add all these expense points for what? Like, why even go through all the hassle there? Unless I really, really want to grow my business to some kind of significant scale. And I think there's this the other big fallacy about entrepreneurship, that the only way to succeed is massive, massive growth over a short period of time. I mean, I think there's a really interesting use versus exchange value question that pushes you into a slightly socialist, conversation if we're talking economics, where there are plenty of use values that I think, if you ask the community, should this building be X, Y, or Z, the exchange value of a certain use, i.e. housing, is probably going to be higher than another use, i.e. farming, but there may be a use value that you consider to be more important. And I think there's a balance that gets lost there, I think, if you just start talking about the conventional market, because inevitably you're taking you're going to inevitably start thinking about like, how can I exchange this for something else that's higher,
Right.
you know,
The highest return possible.
Further.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think the real challenge, and maybe the new point of revolution, and maybe this is where folks like BALLE come into this, is what are the new rubrics of measurement that take into account things outside of strictly just monetary value.
Right.
Or how do you monetize, again, quality of life? Right. And you may end up finding that after you do a really full analysis, that the reality is, if you're looking at a reasonable rate of return, you're going to get more benefit overall than if you're looking for maximized monetary return, and you kind of are minimizing that social and that community level return. So, right. But I'm an optimist. I think there's some cases where those things aren't mutually exclusive, and hopefully there's some high growth opportunities that yield high social impact. So,
right. That's the sweet spot, right?
Right. And I think we're still trying to figure that out, right? On some level.
Exactly. I'm curious, you just in the last couple of months got back from the BALLE conference, and I'm wondering, being surrounded by all those localists and that localist energy and localist work, what's your sort of latest sense of what the movement needs to really get to the next level?
I think it's twofold, and neither one of them are particularly sexy. We need to validate the statements we're making with more hard data. We need to come up, and it may mean that we got to come up with a new rubric that doesn't exist right now.
Yep.
But simply saying is the multiplier effect that happens isn't enough.
Right.
Talking about job creation isn't enough. There needs to be a way we articulate the work that we do and all the different ways it plays itself out, and talk about a way around measuring the impact of that work. And it can be qualitative pieces are just as important. So telling the stories, and this leads to the second part, which is, I think, even pushing harder around this idea of prosperity for all, pushing harder around diversifying what localism looks like for different communities, and having that be reflective in all the institutions we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about these localist networks. I mean, we need to look at particular places and say, okay, why aren't there localist networks in places that have high concentrations of diverse populations? Yeah. What's going on there?
Yeah.
And some of it simply could be, there are localist organizations. They just don't call themselves that.
Exactly.
So how do you and I actually believe that to be the case.
Totally.
But the question is, how do you align with organizations who aren't calling themselves this? And maybe demystifying some of the terminology that gets used,
right? So
that it becomes more of an inclusive conversation. And then on the other side of it, to be able to have a conversation where folks who are used to using this language, even if they're in markets where you don't have these demographic shifts, and I think that's a real struggle for a lot of the existing networks. They're like, well, we'd love to be about prosperity for all, but most of the people we deal with are white, or most of the people we deal with are men. Most of the people, whatever. But it's one of those things where the question has to become part of your core. So even if everybody in your entire network looks exactly the same, there are other points of diversity that can be illustrated and be articulated within that space. And diversity as a thing, as a concept, as a goal, I think needs to be spoken at, not as and not even as a rallying cry. It needs to be. I think when we get to a point where it's just like we see the value in diversity, because I think as long as you're questioning the real value proposition of having a diverse network or having a diversity strategy or making it part of your DNA, it's always going to be an add-on.
Yep.
And I think that's the real question. And I think it comes back to that first piece around how do you measure impact? And part of that's going to be how do you measure diversity as a thing that you do naturally in your space, even if you don't have anybody who looks different. But it's all about how do you rethink how you build networks and how you build teams. So I think those two things were big, and I think more on the frontiering level, it's how do we begin to talk about things that are not either energy or environment as investable social / localist things to invest in. Uh-huh. Food's starting to get hot a bit, but when we're talking about other types of industries that probably are more germane to a lot of, I think particularly the rural context comes up again.
Yeah.
Like if we're not talking about, and in my mind, fairly easy things to pick at. So yeah, I mean, if you want to build a wind farm somewhere, you're probably gonna have that big of a problem finding investment.
Right. Right.
You know, if we're talking about like manufacturing new, I don't know, the next Under Armour, trying to figure out
Right.
what that looks like,
Right.
which may be more germane to certain jurisdictions. It might be harder to get someone off the ground there. And so I think that's another thing I think that is beginning a conversation about what places can we begin to explore, both from an industry standpoint and at a talent pool and geographic standpoint. Where can there be new places, new frontiers where people can go to and say, here's an opportunity, let's really run with it.
Fantastic. It's going to be a big year for both those things, I think.
Let's hope.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, James. This has been the BALLE podcast. Our guest today was James Johnson-Piett, Principal and CEO of Urbane Development and a 2013-2014 BALLE Local Economy Fellow. Thanks so much for your time, James.
Always a pleasure, Andrew. Talk to you soon.
Okay.